The wind howls across empty moorlands tonight as we gather around the fire to explore one of Middle-earth's most haunted and mysterious regions. These are the tales of the Barrow-Downs, where ancient kings sleep restlessly beneath grassy mounds, where treasures of forgotten realms lie guarded by the restless dead, and where even the bravest travellers fear to tread when darkness falls. Tonight, we trace the complete history of these cursed hills, from their origins as a place of honour to their transformation into a realm of terror. Draw close to the flames, for the shadows grow long and the barrow-wights stir when such tales are told. Chapter 1. The High Pastures of the Living. In the elder days, when the world was younger, and the shadow of Morgoth had not yet fallen across all the lands of Middle-earth, the rolling hills that would one day be known as the Barrow-Downs bore a different name and served a far different purpose. These were the Tirn Gorthad, the Barrow-Downs in the Sindarin tongue, but their history begins long before the first burial mound broke their green surface. The hills themselves are ancient beyond measure, shaped by forces that worked upon the earth in the earliest days of Arda's making. Their gentle slopes and broad ridges speak of patient weathering across countless ages, while the deep springs that rise from their hearts suggest roots that reach down to the very bones of the world. In those distant times, before men walked beneath the sun or elves first awakened beside Cuiviénen, these hills knew only the wind and rain, the changing seasons, and the slow dance of grass and stone. When the Eldar first came to Beleriand in the years before the rising of the sun, some among them wandered eastward beyond the borders of that doomed realm. It was these early explorers who gave the hills their Sindarin name and marked them as a place of significance, though their reasons for doing so have been lost to time. Perhaps they sensed something in the land itself, a quality of peace or sanctity that made it suitable for purposes yet undreamed. But it was not the Eldar who first claimed these hills as their own. That honour belongs to the Edain, the fathers of men, who came out of the east in the First Age and allied themselves with the elves in their war against Morgoth. When Beleriand was broken and the sea rushed in to claim that fair land, survivors of the great catastrophe fled eastward, seeking new homes in lands that had escaped the ruin. Among these refugees were the remnants of the House of Beor and the followers of other great chieftains who had served with honour in the wars against darkness. These people, bearing within their hearts both the wisdom gained through alliance with the Eldar and the bitter knowledge of defeat and loss, looked upon the green hills and saw in them a promise of peace and renewal. The settlement of the Tirn Gorthad was gradual and respectful. The Edain who came to these hills were not conquerors but refugees, grateful for any land that would sustain them and their children. They built their settlements in the valleys and on the lower slopes, leaving the highest ridges untouched save for watchposts and beacon fires that could carry word swiftly across the rolling landscape. These early inhabitants were a hardy folk, tempered by generations of warfare and hardship, but not broken by them. They understood the value of strong walls and sharp weapons, but they also knew the importance of fertile fields and peaceful hearths. Under their care, the hills bloomed with a prosperity that had not been seen since the elder days, when the light of the two trees had blessed all growing things. The farms and villages they established were built to last, with stone foundations and timber frames that could withstand the harsh winters and violent storms that sometimes swept across the downs. Their fields were laid out with careful attention to drainage and soil quality, while their pastures supported herds of sheep and cattle that grew fat on the rich grass that covered the hillsides. But perhaps most significantly, these people brought with them traditions of honour and memory that would shape the character of the region for ages to come. They were a people who revered their ancestors and believed that the deeds of the mighty should be remembered for all time. It was this reverence for the past that would eventually transform the Tirn Gorthad from a place of the living into a city of the dead. The first burials in the hills were simple affairs. Respected elders and fallen warriors laid to rest beneath mounds of earth and stone, marked with carved markers that bore their names and deeds. These early graves were scattered throughout the region, each one a small monument to a life well lived and a death worthily met. As generations passed and the population grew, the practice of burial in the hills became more elaborate and formalized. The greatest chieftains and their families claimed the highest ridges for their final resting places, while lesser folk were interred on the slopes below. the mounds grew larger and more complex, incorporating chambers lined with dressed stone and furnished with the grave goods that would serve the dead in whatever realm awaited them beyond the circles of the world. It was during this period, when the hills served primarily as farmland and burial ground for a thriving population, that the first rumours began to spread of strange happenings among the mounds. Shepherds spoke of lights that danced above certain graves on moonless nights, while farmers reported tools and livestock found in impossible locations, as if moved by invisible hands during the dark hours. These incidents were initially dismissed as natural phenomena or the work of living pranksters, but they established a pattern that would grow more pronounced as the centuries passed. Even in these early days, when the Tern Gorthad was still primarily a realm of the living, the boundary between life and death seemed thinner here than in other places. The people who dwelt among the hills developed customs and traditions designed to honour their dead while protecting the living from any unwelcome attention from beyond the grave. Offerings of food and drink were left at grave sites during certain seasons, while protective charms and blessed symbols were incorporated into the construction of new burial mounds. For many centuries, this delicate balance was maintained. The living prospered in the valleys while the dead rested peacefully on the heights, and the Tern Gorthad earned a reputation as a blessed land where the natural order was respected and the proper relationships between past and present were carefully preserved. But all things pass, and the time of peace and prosperity in the hills was destined to end. The seeds of future darkness were already present in the very practices that made the region so peaceful. The concentration of the dead in one location, the wealth buried with fallen kings, and the growing belief that these hills were somehow special, somehow different from ordinary lands. When that darkness finally came, it would transform the Tern Gorthad from a place where the living honoured their dead into a realm where the dead terrorised the living, where ancient treasures became lures for the unwary, and where the very practice of reverent burial became a gateway for malevolent forces that should never have been permitted to enter the world. Chapter 2: The Great Kings and the Crown of Glory. As the centuries of the Second Age unfolded, and the survivors of Beleriand's destruction established themselves firmly in their new homes, the Tern Gorthad gradually transformed from a collection of scattered settlements into the heart of a great kingdom. The people who had once been refugees became the founders of dynasties, and their simple burial mounds gave way to monuments that rivaled the greatest works of their Númenórean kinsmen across the sea. The rise of what would come to be known as the Kingdom of Cardolan began with the emergence of a series of remarkable rulers, men who combined the ancient wisdom of the Edain with the practical skills needed to forge a unified realm from the scattered tribes and settlements that dotted the landscape. These early kings understood that their power rested not just on military might, but on their ability to preserve and honour the traditions that bound their people together. The first of the great burial complexes was constructed for King Aramir, whose name means kingly jewel in the tongue of his people. Aramir had united the warring clans through a combination of diplomatic marriage, military conquest, and sheer force of personality, establishing the foundations of royal authority that would endure for generations. When he died after a reign of 47 years, his subjects felt that no ordinary grave could contain his glory. The construction of Aramir's tomb was a project that consumed the better part of 3 years and required the skills of masons, carvers, and architects drawn from across the growing kingdom. The mound itself was raised to a height unprecedented in the region, its sides faced with dressed stone arranged in intricate patterns that told the story of the king's life and achievements. Within the mound, a complex of chambers was carved from the living rock, each room serving a specific purpose in the elaborate funeral rites that would guide the king's spirit to its final rest. The burial chamber itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry, its walls lined with carved scenes depicting the king's greatest victories and most significant achievements. The ceiling was painted to represent the night sky, with precious stones set into the plaster to mark the positions of the stars on the night of Aramir's birth. At the centre of the chamber stood a bier of black marble, upon which the king's body was laid in state, surrounded by the treasures that had marked his reign. These treasures were not merely ornamental, but served specific purposes in the complex theology that had developed around royal burial. The golden crown that Aramir had worn in life was believed to carry something of his royal authority into the afterlife, while the jeweled sword at his side would serve to defend his kingdom even beyond death. Rings, torques, and ceremonial vessels filled the chamber, each item imbued with symbolic meaning and considerable material value. The tomb of Aramir established precedents that would be followed and expanded upon by each successive ruler. His son, King Baragon the Builder, was interred in an even more elaborate mound, while his grandson, King Aemon the Wise, was laid to rest in a complex that included not just his own burial chamber, but smaller tombs for his favourite hounds, his horse, and even his court musician. As the kingdom of Cardolan grew in power and influence, its burial practices became increasingly sophisticated and religiously complex. The royal tombs were no longer simple resting places, but elaborate religious complexes, where priests maintained eternal vigils, tending sacred flames and performing daily rituals designed to ensure the continued protection and blessing of the royal ancestors. The wealth buried in these tombs was staggering by any measure. Gold and silver accumulated over generations of trade and conquest, precious stones gathered from mines and tribute, weapons and armor crafted by the finest smiths in Middle-earth. All of this and more was interred with the kings and queens who had ruled over the prosperous realm. Each burial added to the treasure hoard that lay beneath the green hills, creating a concentration of wealth that would have been the envy of dragon lords. But the true significance of these burials lay not in their material wealth, but in their spiritual and political importance. The tombs of the great kings became pilgrimage sites where subjects could come to seek guidance and blessing from their royal ancestors. Young princes would spend nights in vigil beside their forefathers' graves, seeking visions that would guide them in their future rule. The very legitimacy of royal authority came to depend upon this connection to the honoured dead. The most magnificent of all these tombs was reserved for King Arafor the Great, who ruled at the height of Cardolan's power, and whose reign marked the golden age of the kingdom. Arafor's tomb was not just a burial mound, but an entire sacred complex, with multiple chambers connected by passages that followed astronomical alignments, ensuring that the light of sun and moon would illuminate different parts of the tomb at significant moments throughout the year. The central burial chamber of Arafor's tomb contained treasures that surpassed even those of his illustrious predecessors. His crown, wrought from gold mined in the distant Misty Mountains and set with gems from the Blue Mountains, was said to catch and hold the light of the stars themselves. His sword, forged by smiths who had learned their craft from the elves of Lindon, was inscribed with runes of power that were said to make it unbreakable in battle and unerring in its aim. Around the king's bier were arranged the emblems of his office and the tokens of his achievements, the sceptre with which he had ruled, the seal with which he had marked his laws, the horn with which he had summoned his armies to battle, and the harp on which he had composed the songs that celebrated his victories. Each item was crafted with exquisite skill and imbued with the accumulated reverence of generations. The funeral of King Arafor marked the pinnacle of Cardolan's power and the peak of the elaborate burial traditions that had developed around the royal house. The ceremony lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, with processions of mourners winding their way up the sacred hills, while priests performed rituals that were said to ensure the king's safe passage to the halls of his fathers. Yet even as these magnificent tombs were being constructed and filled with unimaginable wealth, there were those among the wise who warned that such concentration of treasure and spiritual power in one location might attract attention from forces better left undisturbed. The accumulation of so much gold and so many precious objects in burial chambers that were protected only by stone walls and ancient taboos created temptations that might prove irresistible to those who cared nothing for tradition or honour. More ominously, the very practices that made these burials so spiritually significant also made them vulnerable to corruption. The rituals designed to maintain connection between the living and the dead, the sacred flames that burned eternally in the tomb chambers, the offerings left by pilgrims and supplicants, all of these created channels through which malevolent influences might gain access to the resting places of the kings. As the Second Age drew toward its close and the power of Sauron began to wax once more in the east, these warnings would prove prophetic. The very magnificence of the royal tombs, the wealth they contained, and the spiritual significance they had acquired would make them prime targets for forces that sought to corrupt and pervert all that was noble and sacred in Middle-earth. The transformation of the Tir Gorthad from a place of honoured burial to a realm of supernatural terror would begin with the very treasures and traditions that had made it great, as the accumulated wealth and reverence of centuries became the foundation for horrors that would haunt the hills for ages to come. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Shadow. The Third Age dawned upon Middle-earth with the promise of new beginnings, as the defeat of Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance seemed to herald an era of peace and prosperity for the free peoples. Yet even as the kingdoms of men grew strong and the memory of the Dark Lord's tyranny began to fade, ancient evils stirred in forgotten places, and the very prosperity of the age created new temptations for those whose hearts were touched by greed and malice. For the kingdom of Cardolan and its sacred burial grounds in the Tir Gorthad, the early centuries of the Third Age represented the continuation of traditions established soon after the realm's founding, but with a gradual decline in the spiritual vigour that had once protected the realm from corruption. The great kings who had established the royal burial customs were followed by lesser men, rulers who maintained the forms of ancient custom, while lacking the depth of wisdom and strength of will that had characterized their predecessors. This decline was subtle at first, noticed only by the most perceptive observers. The priests who maintained the eternal vigils in the royal tombs began to report strange dreams and inexplicable difficulties in their rituals. Sacred flames that had burned without fail for centuries began to flicker and dim at unexpected moments. Pilgrims who came to seek guidance from the royal ancestors returned home with tales of whispered voices that spoke words of despair rather than hope. The treasure that lay buried beneath the hills had grown beyond all reasonable measure, accumulated through centuries of prosperous rule, and expanded by the tributes and gifts that neighbouring kingdoms offered to the dead kings of Cardolan. The very weight of so much gold and silver and precious stone concentrated in one location seemed to create a spiritual gravity that drew the attention of beings whose nature was inimical to all life and light. It was during the reign of King Araval, in the year 1300 of the Third Age, that the first definitive reports of supernatural activity began to emerge from the Barrow-Downs. A group of merchants travelling the North Road reported seeing lights moving among the burial mounds at midnight. Not the steady glow of sacred flames, but something that pulsed and flickered with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. When brave men were sent to investigate, they found no explanation for the phenomena, but several of the investigators reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and malice emanating from certain of the ancient tombs. These early manifestations were initially attributed to natural causes or the work of grave robbers, but as the incidents increased in frequency and intensity, it became clear that something far more sinister was at work. The very soil of the hills seemed to have become corrupted, turning black and lifeless in patches that spread slowly but inexorably outward from the oldest burial mounds. Plants withered without apparent cause, while animals fled the region as if driven by instincts too ancient and fundamental to ignore. The source of this corruption lay not in any single act of evil, but in the gradual accumulation of malevolent influence that had been drawn to the concentrated wealth and spiritual significance of the royal burial ground. The Barrow-Downs had become a nexus of power, but power without proper guardianship inevitably attracts those who would use it for dark purposes. The first of the evil spirits to take up residence in the ancient tombs was drawn by the very practices that had once protected the realm. The eternal flames that burned in the burial chambers, intended to provide light and warmth for the spirits of the dead kings, instead became beacons that attracted beings from the shadow realm, creatures that fed upon the boundary between life and death, and delighted in the corruption of sacred places. These entities, known to the wise as barrow-wights, were not the spirits of the buried kings themselves, but parasitic beings that took up residence in the tomb chambers and fed upon the spiritual resonance of the treasures buried there. They were creatures of spite and malice, delighting in the perversion of honour and the corruption of memory, transforming places of reverence into lairs of terror. The process by which the barrow-wights established themselves in the tombs was gradual and insidious. At first, their presence was barely detectable, a slight chill in chambers that should have been warmed by eternal flames, a sense of wrongness that made the priests uneasy without being able to identify its source. But as the creatures grew stronger, feeding upon the accumulated spiritual energy of the burial sites, their influence became more pronounced and more dangerous. The transformation of the royal tombs from sacred shrines to haunted lairs was accelerated by the very wealth that the kings had carried with them into death. The golden crowns and jeweled swords, the rings and torques and ceremonial vessels, all of these had been imbued with the reverence and awe of generations, making them potent focuses for supernatural influence. In the hands of the Barrow-wights, these treasures became instruments of enchantment and domination, used to lure the unwary into the tomb chambers, where they would fall under the malevolent spirit's control. The first recorded disappearance occurred in 1320, when a young prince of Cardolan undertook the traditional vigil beside his grandfather's tomb, and was found the next morning in a state of catatonic terror. His hair turned white, and his mind apparently shattered by whatever he had encountered in the darkness. He never spoke coherently again, but in his ravings, he spoke of the old king who had called to him from the depths of the burial chamber, promising him riches and power beyond imagining, if only he would descend into the darkness and claim his inheritance. As word of such incidents spread, the common people began to avoid the Barrow-Downs altogether, and even the nobility grew reluctant to perform the traditional ceremonies that had once been considered essential to maintaining the kingdom's spiritual health. The priests who had maintained the eternal vigils abandoned their posts one by one, some fleeing in terror after encountering the malevolent presences that now inhabited the tombs, others simply disappearing without trace during their night watches. The kingdom of Cardolan, deprived of the spiritual foundation that had sustained it for so many centuries, began to decline with increasing rapidity. Without the blessing and guidance of their royal ancestors, the living kings found their authority challenged and their wisdom questioned. Civil strife broke out as various claimants to the throne argued over succession rights that could no longer be validated through communion with the honoured dead. By 1356, the process of decay had advanced so far that the kingdom of Cardolan effectively ceased to exist as a unified realm, fragmenting into squabbling petty kingdoms and lawless territories. The Barrow-Downs, once the sacred heart of a great kingdom, were now avoided by all who valued their lives and sanity, becoming a desolate waste where only the boldest or most desperate travellers dared to venture. Yet the corruption that had claimed the ancient burial ground was not content to remain confined to the hilltops where the great kings lay buried. Like a poison spreading through the veins of the earth itself, the malevolent influence began to extend its reach, affecting the surrounding countryside and threatening to transform the entire region into a wasteland of supernatural terror. The stage was now set for the final act in the transformation of the Tyne Gorthad from sacred burial ground to cursed realm, as the Barrow-wights that had claimed the tombs of the ancient kings prepared to extend their dominion over all who might dare to challenge their possession of the treasures they guarded with such jealous malevolence. Chapter 4. The Reign of the Wights. In the desolate years that followed the collapse of Cardolan, as the once mighty kingdom fragmented into feuding lordships and lawless territories, the Barrow-Downs entered their darkest period. The malevolent spirits that had taken possession of the ancient tombs were no longer content to lurk in the shadows, feeding upon the spiritual residue of forgotten kings. They had grown strong on centuries of accumulated reverence and the concentrated wealth of the burial chambers, and now they sought to extend their dominion over all who dared enter their realm. The Barrow-wights that ruled the Cursed Hills were not mere ghosts or restless spirits of the dead, but something far more sinister and alien. They were beings from the shadow realm that existed between life and death, creatures of malice and hunger that had been drawn to the Barrow-Downs by the powerful emanations of the royal treasures and the unquiet dead. Having established themselves in the tomb chambers, they had gradually usurped the identities of the buried kings, wearing their forms like stolen garments, while perverting everything those rulers had once represented. The transformation of the landscape itself reflected the spiritual corruption that had claimed the region. Where once green grass had covered the rolling hills, now patches of sickly yellow vegetation struggled to survive in soil that had turned black and bitter. The springs that had once provided clear, sweet water now ran with streams that were dark and foul-tasting, while the very air seemed thick with an oppressive malevolence that made breathing difficult and filled the hearts of travellers with inexplicable dread. The tombs themselves had become focal points of supernatural terror, their entrance passages glowing with a cold, phosphorescent light that could be seen from great distances on moonless nights. Those who were unlucky enough to glimpse these eerie illuminations reported that the light seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a slow heartbeat, as if the hills themselves had become living things that breathed with malevolent purpose. Within the burial chambers, the ancient treasures had taken on properties that went far beyond their original material value. The golden crowns of the dead kings now burned with a fire that was cold rather than warm, while their jeweled swords hummed with an energy that spoke of hunger rather than protection. The very walls of the tomb chambers seemed to pulse with unnatural life, as if the stone itself had been infected by the presence of the creatures that now claimed dominion over the sacred spaces. The Barrow-wights had developed a sophisticated understanding of mortal psychology, learning to use the treasures buried with the ancient kings as lures to draw the living into their grasp. They would project visions of golden hoards and magical weapons into the minds of those who passed near the cursed hills, filling their thoughts with images of wealth and power that grew more compelling with each viewing. Many who encountered these mental intrusions found themselves unable to resist the call, walking like sleepwalkers toward the tomb entrances despite every instinct warning them of danger. Those who fell under the Wights' influence were rarely seen again, though their fates were sometimes revealed through the nightmarish experiences of others who escaped the creature's clutches. The Barrow-wights delighted in psychological torture, trapping their victims in elaborate illusions where they believed themselves to be living in the glorious past of Cardolan's golden age, serving as courtiers to the great kings whose tombs they had invaded. Only gradually would the victims realize that the magnificent halls they thought they inhabited were actually burial chambers, that the royal feast they believed they were attending was composed of dust and decay, and that the noble kings they served were actually malevolent spirits wearing the faces of the long dead. The creature's power extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the burial mounds themselves. They could reach out across considerable distances to influence the dreams and thoughts of mortals, planting seeds of obsession and greed that would eventually draw their victims to the Barrow-Downs. Merchants travelling the North Road would find themselves plagued by dreams of vast treasure hoards, while soldiers would be tormented by visions of magical weapons that could make them invincible in battle. The Barrow-wights also demonstrated a cruel intelligence in their choice of victims, showing a particular preference for those whose loss would cause the greatest grief and disruption among the living. Young nobles on their first adventures, scholars seeking ancient knowledge, and heroes whose courage had made them famous throughout the region. All of these were special targets for the creature's malevolent attention. The few who managed to escape from the Barrow-wights' clutches brought back tales that served as warnings to others, though their accounts were often dismissed as the ravings of minds broken by terror. They spoke of vast halls beneath the hills where the dead kings sat upon thrones of bone, wearing crowns that blazed with cold fire while commanding armies of corpses in elaborate ceremonies that mocked the rituals of the living. They described chambers filled with treasures beyond counting, but treasures that turned to dust and ash at the touch of mortal hands, leaving only the bitter taste of decay and the echo of mocking laughter. As the Barrow-wights' power grew, they began to extend their influence beyond the hills themselves, sending forth lesser spirits to establish footholds in other burial grounds throughout the region. Ancient graveyards that had once been places of peaceful rest became centers of supernatural activity, while even simple roadside graves began to show signs of corruption and unnatural influence. The roads that passed near the Barrow-Downs became increasingly dangerous, as travelers reported encounters with phantom horsemen who rode the ancient paths at midnight, their mounts' hooves striking sparks from stones that glowed with phosphorescent fire. These spectral riders were said to be the corrupted spirits of ancient knights, bound to the service of the Barrow-wights, and charged with expanding their master's dominion over the surrounding countryside. The influence of the cursed hills even reached into the dreams and nightmares of people who lived many leagues away, as the Barrow-wights' hunger for mortal souls drove them to cast their nets ever wider. Children would wake screaming from dreams of dark tunnels and grasping hands, while adults found themselves drawn to undertake seemingly innocent journeys that would inevitably lead them toward the haunted downs. The few settlements that remained in the vicinity of the Barrow-Downs became increasingly isolated and desperate as the supernatural terror made normal trade and communication impossible. Villages that had prospered for centuries found themselves cut off from the outside world, their populations dwindling as young people fled to safer regions and visitors learned to avoid the cursed area entirely. It was during this darkest period that the Barrow-wights achieved perhaps their greatest triumph, the complete corruption of the tomb of King Arathor the Great. This magnificent burial complex, once the crown jewel of Cardolan's royal necropolis, became the primary stronghold of the evil spirits, its multiple chambers serving as a headquarters from which they coordinated their assault upon the world of the living. The transformation of this great king's tomb was particularly significant because of the enormous spiritual and material wealth it contained. The king's crown, sword, and other regalia had been objects of veneration for generations, imbued with the accumulated respect and awe of an entire kingdom. In the hands of the Barrow-wights, these sacred objects became instruments of domination and corruption, their holy purposes inverted to serve the cause of evil. Yet even in their hour of greatest triumph, the Barrow-wights carried within themselves the seeds of their eventual downfall. Their very success in corrupting the ancient burial ground had made them dependent upon the treasures and spiritual energy they had claimed, binding them to the hills in ways that would eventually prove to be limitations as well as sources of power. The day would come when heroes would arise who possessed both the courage and the wisdom needed to challenge the creature's dominion, but that day still lay far in the future, and the reign of terror would continue for many dark years to come. Chapter 5: The Old Forest and the Ring of Protection. As the malevolent influence of the Barrow-wights spread outward from the cursed hills like ripples on a dark pond, their expansion was checked in one direction by a force that proved surprisingly resistant to their corrupting touch. To the north and west of the Barrow-Downs lay the Old Forest, a realm of ancient trees that possessed their own form of consciousness and will, and which had no intention of yielding their domain to creatures from the Shadow Realm. The Old Forest was itself a remnant of the vast woodlands that had once covered much of Middle-earth in the Elder Days, when the trees were stronger and more aware than they would become in later ages. These ancient oaks and willows, beeches and chestnuts had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the coming and going of races, and the slow changes that time brought to all living things. They had developed a deep suspicion of anything that threatened the natural order, whether it came in the form of axes and fire or supernatural corruption. The trees of the Old Forest had been aware of the growing evil in the Barrow-Downs long before mortal men recognized the threat. Their roots, which extended deep into the earth and spread far beneath the surface, had felt the corruption spreading through the soil and had recoiled from contact with the tainted ground. The forest had begun to withdraw from the edges nearest the downs, pulling back its borders and creating a no-man's land of withered stumps and barren earth. But retreat was not the only response the forest could make to the threat. As the Barrow-wights' power grew and their influence began to affect the area around the ancient trees, the forest struck back with weapons of its own. The paths that led from the downs into the woodland became confused and misleading, turning travellers in circles until they emerged exactly where they had entered. Streams that had once flowed clear and straight began to meander through impossible courses, creating barriers of marsh and bogland that discouraged any approach from the cursed hills. The trees themselves became more active and aggressive in their defense of their realm. Branches that had once merely rustled in the wind now reached out to entangle unwary travelers, while roots rose from the earth to trip and confuse those who tried to pass. The very air within the forest grew thick and oppressive, filled with a sense of watchful intelligence that made visitors feel distinctly unwelcome. Yet the forest's hostility was not indiscriminate. Those who approached with respect and peaceful intentions often found their passage surprisingly easy, as if the trees recognized the difference between friend and foe. This selective response suggested a level of consciousness and discrimination that went far beyond what most people attributed to woodland vegetation. The struggle between the Old Forest and the barrow-wights created a unique equilibrium in the region, with each force checking the expansion of the other. The forest's living awareness proved resistant to the death-focused corruption of the wights, while the supernatural malevolence of the cursed hills seemed to affect the trees in ways that made them more alert and aggressive than they might otherwise have been. This balance was maintained by the presence of Tom Bombadil, the strange and powerful being who dwelt in a house at the very edge of the Old Forest, and claimed dominion over both the trees and the hills beyond. Tom was an enigma even to the wise, a creature whose origins and nature remained mysterious, but whose power over the natural world was undeniable. He was old beyond measure, claiming to remember the first rainfall and the first acorn, and his authority in his chosen domain was absolute. Tom's relationship with both the forest and the barrow-wights was complex and carefully balanced. He did not permit the evil spirits to extend their influence into his territory, but neither did he take direct action to destroy them or reclaim the treasures they guarded. Instead, he maintained a kind of supernatural quarantine, containing the corruption within defined boundaries while ensuring that it could not spread to threaten the wider world. The methods by which Tom maintained this balance were as mysterious as the being himself. He would walk among the ancient trees singing songs that seemed to calm their more aggressive tendencies, while his presence alone was enough to keep the barrow-wights confined to their tomb chambers. Travellers who encountered him often reported that he spoke of the wights as if they were merely wayward children who had gotten into mischief, rather than the terrifying supernatural predators that others knew them to be. Tom's house, nestled in a clearing where the Old Forest met the lower slopes of the Barrow-Downs, served as a neutral ground where the laws of neither realm held complete sway. Visitors who were fortunate enough to be invited to Tom's table found themselves temporarily protected from both the malevolence of the wights and the hostility of the trees, able to rest and recover their strength before continuing their journeys. The protective influence that Tom exercised over the region extended beyond mere containment of evil to include active assistance for those who found themselves in genuine need. Lost travellers would sometimes discover that paths they were certain had not existed, moments before would appear to guide them to safety, while those who were pursued by supernatural threats might find unexpected allies in the form of helpful trees or convenient streams that blocked their pursuers' path. Yet Tom's protection came with its own conditions and limitations. He would aid those who approached his realm with honest intentions and genuine need, but he showed little patience for treasure seekers or adventurers whose primary motivation was greed or the desire for glory. Such individuals often found that the paths through his domain led them in circles, eventually depositing them back where they had started, with nothing to show for their efforts but exhaustion and confusion. The long-term effect of Tom's presence in the region was to create a stable boundary between the natural world and the supernatural corruption of the Barrow-Downs. This boundary was not absolute. Determined individuals could still make their way to the cursed hills if they truly insisted, but it served as a filter that discouraged casual exploration while providing protection for innocent travellers who might otherwise stumble unknowingly into danger. The Old Forest itself, under Tom's influence, developed into something approaching a living fortress, its ancient trees forming an organic barrier that channeled travellers away from the most dangerous approaches to the Barrow-Downs, while providing sanctuary for those who genuinely needed it. The forest paths that Tom sang into being were more than mere tracks through the woodland. They were conduits of protective power that could guide the innocent to safety, while confusing and misdirecting those whose intentions were malevolent. The relationship between the Old Forest and the Barrow-Downs during this period was one of eternal tension, with each realm maintaining its own character and power, while respecting the boundaries that separated them. The trees understood that the evil in the hills was contained and controlled, while the barrow-wights learned that their influence had limits that they crossed at their peril. This careful balance would endure for many centuries, creating a unique situation where supernatural evil was held in check, not by heroic intervention or divine decree, but by the patient guardianship of nature itself and the mysterious will of a being whose power seemed to flow from sources older and deeper than any mortal comprehension. Chapter 6: The Heroes and the Cleansing Light. As the Third Age drew toward its climax and the final confrontation between light and darkness approached, the long isolated realm of the Barrow-Downs would at last play a role in the greater events that would determine the fate of Middle-earth. The Cursed Hills, which had remained for so long a place of terror, avoided by all but the most desperate or foolhardy, would become the stage for encounters that demonstrated both the power of ancient evil and the courage of those who stood against it. The first significant challenge to the Barrow-wights' dominion came not from any great hero or armed expedition, but from 4 small travellers whose courage far exceeded their size. When Frodo Baggins and his companions found themselves lost in the Old Forest during their flight from the Shire, their encounter with Tom Bombadil set in motion a series of events that would test both their resolve and the supernatural defences that had protected the Cursed Hills for so many centuries. Tom's decision to send the hobbits through the Barrow-Downs rather than around them was not made lightly or without purpose. The Master of the Old Forest understood that the time was approaching when the evil that had festered in the ancient tombs would need to be confronted directly, and he recognised in the ring-bearer and his companions the kind of pure-hearted courage that might prove capable of challenging forces that had terrorised the region for generations. The hobbits' passage through the Downs began innocently enough, with the 4 companions making good time across the rolling hills in the clear light of day. But as afternoon faded toward evening, and fog began to rise from the hollows between the mounds, they found themselves entering a realm where the normal laws of time and space seemed to operate differently than in the world beyond. The mist that enveloped them was not ordinary fog, but a manifestation of the Barrow-wights' power, designed to confuse and disorient travellers while leading them inexorably toward the tomb entrances where the evil spirits waited with hungry patience. Within the fog, distances became meaningless, and directions shifted without warning, while time itself seemed to slow and quicken according to no natural rhythm. It was in this supernatural maze that the hobbits encountered their greatest test, as one by one they fell under the influence of the Barrow-wights' hypnotic power. The evil spirits, sensing the approach of travellers who carried something of great significance, had prepared their most potent enchantments, weaving illusions that would appeal to each hobbit's particular nature and desires. Frodo found himself experiencing visions of the Shire's distant past, walking through landscapes that seemed familiar yet subtly wrong, meeting ancestors whose faces he recognised but whose words carried undertones of threat and malice. His companions were similarly ensnared, each trapped in a web of dreams and false memories that gradually drew them toward the gaping entrance of an ancient tomb. The barrow from which they were eventually rescued by Tom Bombadil was one of the most significant burial sites in the entire necropolis, the tomb of the last king of Cardolan, who had ruled during the kingdom's final decline and whose burial had marked the end of an era. The chamber into which the hobbits were drawn contained treasures that represented the accumulated wealth and power of generations, but these riches had been corrupted by centuries of contact with supernatural evil. Within the tomb, the hobbits experienced the full horror of the Barrow-wights' power, finding themselves dressed in the grave clothes of ancient kings, while cold hands reached out from the darkness to claim them for the realm of the unquiet dead. The treasure that surrounded them, golden crowns and jeweled weapons, precious stones and works of art beyond price, all of it carried the taint of corruption that transformed beauty into horror and promise into threat. It was only Tom Bombadil's timely intervention that saved the hobbits from becoming permanent additions to the Barrow-wights' collection of victims. His song of power, echoing through the tomb chambers with authority that the evil spirits could not resist, drove back the supernatural darkness and restored the normal flow of time and consciousness to the ensorcelled travellers. But Tom's rescue of the hobbits involved more than simply driving away the Barrow-wights and leading the travellers to safety. In a gesture that demonstrated both his power and his understanding of the larger forces at work in Middle-earth, he armed the hobbits with weapons taken from the very tomb that had nearly claimed them, ancient blades forged in the kingdom of Cardolan and imbued with enchantments specifically designed to harm creatures of shadow and corruption. These weapons, particularly the sword that would later be wielded by Merry Brandybuck at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, carried within their metal the concentrated will and purpose of their original makers, smiths who had understood the reality of supernatural evil and had crafted their works accordingly. The Barrow-wights' long guardianship of these treasures had ironically preserved them for the moment when they would be needed to strike against the very forces of darkness they had been created to combat. The Hobbits' escape from the Barrow-Downs marked a turning point in the long history of the Cursed Hills. For the first time in centuries, mortals had entered the realm of the Barrow-wights and emerged not only alive, but armed with weapons taken from the creatures' own hordes. The psychological impact of this reversal was significant, demonstrating that the evil spirits were not invulnerable and that their treasures could be reclaimed by those with sufficient courage and proper guidance. More significantly, the encounter established a connection between the ancient evil of the Barrow-Downs and the greater conflict that was building toward its climax across Middle-earth. The weapons that the hobbits carried with them would play crucial roles in the battles to come, while their first-hand experience of supernatural evil would prepare them for the challenges they would face in their quest to destroy the One Ring. The Barrow-wights themselves were left diminished by this encounter, their aura of invincibility shattered and their confidence shaken. The loss of some of their most prized treasures was more than a material blow. It was a spiritual defeat that weakened their hold over the entire region and made them more vulnerable to future challenges. In the years that followed, as word spread of mortals who had faced the Barrow-wights and lived to tell the tale, other brave souls began to venture into the Cursed Hills. Most of these expeditions ended in disaster, with the would-be heroes joining the ranks of the Wights' victims, but a few succeeded in recovering additional treasures and further weakening the evil spirit's power. The final cleansing of the Barrow-Downs would not come until after the War of the Ring, when King Elisar turned his attention to the task of reclaiming all the dark places that had fallen under the shadow during the long years of Sauron's influence. Armed with the wisdom of the ages and supported by the resurgent power of light in Middle-earth, the king and his companions would at last enter the ancient tombs and drive out the creatures that had corrupted them. What they certainly accomplished was more than simply destroying the Barrow-wights. Any true restoration would have required the careful cleansing of every chamber and passage, the purification of treasures that had been tainted by centuries of contact with evil, and the re-establishment of the spiritual protections that had once kept the tombs safe from supernatural intrusion. If such work was indeed completed, the hills would have resumed their proper role as a memorial to the great kings of the past, while also becoming something more, a monument to the power of courage and determination to overcome even the most ancient and entrenched evil. The treasures that might have been recovered from such cleansed tombs would serve as reminders of both the glory of the past and the price of allowing that glory to be corrupted by complacency and spiritual decay. Epilogue. The memory of stone and grass. Today, the Barrow-Downs lie peaceful beneath the open sky, their ancient mounds covered once again with green grass that waves gently in the wind. Travellers who pass through the hills in the Fourth Age find little to suggest the centuries of terror that once made this region a place to be avoided at all costs. The tomb entrances have been sealed and blessed, the treasures have been removed to safer keeping, and the very air seems lighter and cleaner than it was during the dark years of the Wights' dominion. Yet for those who know how to look, signs of the region's troubled past remain visible in the landscape itself. The patterns of the burial mounds, the alignments of ancient stone circles, the subtle variations in the colour and texture of the grass, all of these speak to eyes that can read them of the great kings who once ruled from these hills, and the supernatural forces that later claimed their tombs. The old forest, too, has changed in the years since the cleansing of the Downs. The trees no longer maintain their aggressive vigilance against supernatural intrusion, and the paths through the woodland have become clearer and more welcoming to travellers. Tom Bombadil continues to dwell in his house at the forest's edge, his long guardianship of the region a constant through the changing ages. The restored peace of the Barrow-Downs serves as more than just a local victory over ancient evil. It represents a template for the kind of patient, determined effort required to heal the wounds that darkness can inflict upon the world. The process of cleansing the cursed hills required not just heroic courage, but also scholarly wisdom, spiritual understanding, and the cooperation of many different people working toward a common goal. Modern visitors to the region often pause to consider the long history that lies beneath their feet, the peaceful farms and prosperous villages of the early years, the magnificent tombs of the great kings, the centuries of supernatural terror, and finally the restoration of light and hope. Each era has left its mark upon the landscape, creating a palimpsest of memory that speaks to the complex relationship between past and present. The weapons that were recovered from the Barrow-Wights hordes have found their way into the collections of scholars and historians, where they are studied not just as artifacts of metalworking skill, but as examples of the spiritual warfare that characterized so much of Middle-earth's history. The blade that Merry carried at the Pelennor Fields, in particular, has become a symbol of how the wisdom and courage of the past can be preserved and transmitted to future generations in times of need. The stories of the Barrow-Wights themselves have passed into legend, told around hearthfires as cautionary tales about the dangers of spiritual complacency and the importance of maintaining proper respect for the boundaries between life and death. Parents use these stories to teach their children about courage and wisdom, while scholars study them for insights into the nature of evil and the methods by which it can be overcome. Perhaps most significantly, the history of the Barrow-Downs has become a testament to the power of redemption and renewal. The hills that once epitomized the corruption of sacred spaces have been transformed into symbols of hope and restoration, demonstrating that no place is so thoroughly corrupted that it cannot be cleansed by sufficient determination and proper understanding. The ancient kings of Cardolan, whose restless spirits were finally laid to peace when their tombs were cleansed and blessed, are remembered now not as victims of supernatural corruption, but as examples of the noble traditions that make such restoration possible. Their treasures, studied and displayed in the great libraries and museums of the Fourth Age, serve as reminders of the heights that mortal civilizations can achieve when they are guided by wisdom and honor. The lesson that emerges from the long and troubled history of the Tern Gorthad is ultimately one of hope tempered by vigilance. The evil that once claimed these hills was real and powerful, capable of corrupting even the most sacred traditions and turning places of honor into realms of terror. But that same evil was also ultimately vulnerable to the combined forces of courage, wisdom, and determination applied with proper understanding and spiritual authority. For future generations, who may face their own encounters with forces that seek to corrupt and destroy what is good and sacred in the world, the story of the Barrow-Downs offers both warning and encouragement. It reminds us that evil can take root in the most unexpected places, and that the very things we hold most sacred can become sources of temptation and corruption if we fail to guard them properly. But it also demonstrates that no evil, however ancient or entrenched, is ultimately stronger than the forces of light, when those forces are properly organized and directed. The patient guardianship of Tom Bombadil, the courage of the hobbits who faced the Wights in their own domain, and the determined effort of King Elisar and his companions to cleanse the corrupted tombs, all of these represent different aspects of the multifaceted approach required to overcome spiritual darkness. As we sit here by our own fireside, safe in the knowledge that the Barrow-Downs have been restored to peace, and that the terrors of the Wights are now only memories preserved in story and song, we can take comfort in the knowledge that others before us have faced seemingly impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them. The grass grows green again over the ancient mounds, the springs run clear and sweet, and the wind that blows across the hills carries no taint of supernatural malice. The long story of the Tern Gorthad, from their origins as peaceful farmland through their transformation into royal necropolis, their corruption by supernatural evil, and their ultimate restoration to sanctity, reminds us that history is not a simple progression from past to present, but a complex weaving of triumph and disaster, wisdom and folly, light and darkness. In understanding this complexity, we prepare ourselves to face whatever challenges may await us in our own time. Thanks for joining us in this deep dive tonight. Until next time, stay safe and stay by the fire.